What's unfolding in Brazil right now really has the feeling of a high-stakes drama. We're seeing a Supreme Court investigation kick off,
Yeah.
fueled by claims of political persecution, and the whole thing is sort of spilling over into the international arena.
It's a really significant moment. It highlights the tensions, that can arise within a democracy when institutions and political actors clash like this.
Okay, let's get right to the heart of it then. Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro is now the subject of an investigation. This was requested by Brazil's Prosecutor General's office, the PGR.
Right.
And the accusation is that he's been actively working against the Brazilian judiciary, but from the United States, where he's apparently been living since February.
And just to set the stage a bit, the key figures here are Supreme Court Minister Alexandre de Moraes. He's been appointed as the rapporteur.
Okay.
Which means he essentially the lead investigator for this case within the court.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Congressman Bolsonaro himself was a very, very prominent figure.
And the initial news, the thing that brought this to light, came from CNN Brazil, right? They reported on the PGR's formal request and Moraes getting appointed.
That's right.
It immediately makes you wonder, well, what exactly prompted this specific move?
Absolutely. I mean, the decision to investigate a sitting congressman on grounds like these, well, it's not taken lightly. It suggests a pretty significant escalation of existing political tensions.
So for you listening, our goal in this deep dive is really to try and dissect this complex situation, understand the different viewpoints flying around, and, grasp the potential ramifications down the line.
Yeah, because this isn't just about one person, is it? It touches upon really fundamental principles like, the boundaries of free speech, the whole separation of powers thing, and that delicate balance between national sovereignty and, well, international engagement.
All right, let's delve into the specifics then. The investigation itself. What exactly is the PGR alleging that Eduardo Bolsonaro has done that warrants this level of scrutiny?
Okay, so the core of the PGR's accusation is that while he was residing in the United States, Congressman Bolsonaro engaged in actions aimed at undermining the Brazilian judiciary.
Undermining how, exactly?
Well, the legal basis they're citing is the potential crime of violent abolition of the democratic state of law. Now, this is a very serious charge.
Sounds it.
Yeah, it carries a possible sentence of up to 12 years in prison.
12 years. Wow, that really underscores the gravity here. So what specific actions are they pointing to? Like, what did he allegedly do from the U.S. that counts as such a severe offense?
According to the PGR, the evidence lies in statements the congressman made during interviews and also through his activity on social media.
Okay, standard political stuff maybe, or more than that.
Well, their argument is that these communications show a clear intent to obstruct the normal functioning of Brazil's governing powers. That's the claim.
It still sounds quite broad, doesn't it? Are there any specifics mentioned in the reports about what he actually said or posted?
Our immediate sources don't give us, verbatim quotes from the PGR's request itself. But the implication, the strong implication, is that his criticisms of the judiciary, made while he was abroad, crossed some kind of threshold.
A threshold.
Into actively seeking to diminish its authority and legitimacy. And what's particularly notable here, and connects internationally, is the link to U.S. Senator Marco Rubio's public statements.
Ah, right. I remember that.
Yeah, before a congressional committee. His admission that he was considering potential sanctions against Mr. Alexandre de Moraes, well, that adds a pretty significant international layer to these accusations against Bolsonaro.
Ah, okay. So the argument seems to be that Bolsonaro's criticisms, maybe because they were spoken in an American context and potentially aimed at encouraging external pressure on the Brazilian judiciary, that's being interpreted as an action against the Brazilian democratic order itself.
Precisely. That seems to be the core of it. The PGR appears to be contending that his efforts to, get international attention and maybe influence external actors against a branch of the Brazilian government.
Yeah.
That constitutes a threat to the country's democratic institutions.
Okay. Now, turning to the reactions, Ricardo Diaz, he had a pretty strong initial take on all this. He didn't seem surprised, and his response was quite pointed, wasn't it?
That's right. Very pointed. His initial reaction was just dripping with sarcasm, actually. And he essentially framed this whole investigation as a strategic blunder, a shot in the foot, he called it.
How so?
Because, he argued, it ironically lends credence to Congressman Bolsonaro's own claims of political persecution. His view seems to be that the very act of launching this investigation kind of validates Bolsonaro's narrative.
Yeah, and he really zeroed in on the fact that Alexandre de Moraes was appointed as the rapporteur, didn't he? I remember picking up on his sarcastic remarks, something like, oh, Gendau's going to be the one in charge. Did it fall to him in the draw?
Exactly. That kind of tone.
The implication, of course, being that Moraes, who's often been a target of Bolsonaro's criticism, couldn't possibly be an impartial investigator in this.
The sarcasm was definitely a key element of Dias's commentary. He even used hyperbole, mocking the idea that Bolsonaro's words for the U.S. could pose a real threat, saying things like, invade the United States. I'm going to order an invasion, Moraes. I'm going to order...
Right. Just highlighting the absurdity from his point of view.
Precisely. It's his way of emphasizing what he sees as the absurdity of the charges themselves.
And he raised a pretty fundamental question, one I think a lot of people would ask. How can Eduardo Bolsonaro, just speaking his mind in another country, actually impede a Supreme Court minister from doing his job? Dias seemed to view the whole thing as, well, a bit of a reach.
Exactly. Dias characterizes this investigation as an act of desperation, really, and calls the accusations mere rhetoric. He's suggesting the reaction is just disproportionate, maybe unwarranted. He even drew a sarcastic comparison to past investigations involving Lula, implying, a potential bias or double standard in how the justice system operates depending on who's involved.
It's like he's saying, look, when the political winds blew the other way, the response to similar stuff was totally different. Okay, so now let's look at how Eduardo Bolsonaro himself responded. He didn't exactly mince words, did he?
Not at all.
Yeah.
In his video statement, he came out swinging, asserting that Brazil is currently living under a regime of exception. That's a very strong statement.
Yeah, suggesting normal rules don't apply.
Right, that democracy is being suspended or ignored in some way.
And he made a pretty massive accusation against the judiciary itself, claiming, quote, everything in the judiciary depends on who the client is. That speaks volumes about a lack of trust, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
A deep-seated lack of trust in the system's fairness and impartiality. He also argued that figures on the left in Brazil in the past engaged in more significant international actions, including direct criticisms of Supreme Court ministers, even the presidency, without facing these kinds of legal repercussions. He's essentially pointing to what he sees as clear political bias in how the law is being applied here.
And he was defiant. He made it clear this investigation wouldn't stop him.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, he seemed to escalate his rhetoric, stating that both he and Minister Moraes are now viewed internationally by some as human rights violators.
Wow. And then he appealed directly to the U.S.
Yes, his direct appeal to U.S. figures like Senator Marco Rubio and former President Donald Trump is a really crucial part of his response. He explicitly called for them to impose sanctions on Minister Moraes and what he called his tyrannical gang.
So a direct solicitation of foreign intervention in Brazil's internal affairs.
Pretty much, yeah. Explicitly asking for it.
And he wrapped it up with a very dramatic, almost defiant tone, saying something like, may God bless Brazil, may God bless America, and we will win. Feels like a rallying cry.
It definitely does. And it just underscores the highly polarized political climate in Brazil right now. This sense of an ongoing, really intense political struggle. Which actually brings up an important historical angle here.
Which is?
The precedent of Brazilians seeking international intervention when they feel wronged by their own government. This isn't entirely new territory.
Okay. And that's where Daniel Rittner from CNN Brazil comes in, offering a perspective on what he sees as a potential, let's say, inconsistency.
Exactly. He points out that back in 2017 and 2018, the partner of a prominent PT leader gave tons of international interviews. And what was she doing? Accusing the Brazilian judicial system of politically persecuting Lula, who was in prison then.
Right. I remember that being reported internationally.
And he also reminds us that a current member of the Supreme Court, the STF, who used to be Lula's lawyer, well, he himself denounced alleged political persecution while he was in Europe.
So the argument is, if that wasn't a crime.
Well, Rittner raises that critical question. He says, basically, if asking for external help against alleged abuse of authority is a crime, well, let's think about closing the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the International Criminal Court. He's challenging the whole logic of criminalizing seeking international help when you feel domestic channels are biased.
It really does make you think about the line, doesn't it, between legitimate criticism, even seeking international support, and something that crosses over into, harmful interference. Where is that line?
Precisely. And William Wack, also from CNN Brazil, adds even deeper historical context. He reminds us that during the military dictatorship in Brazil back in the 70s,
Right.
victims of that regime actively sought, and in some cases successfully obtained intervention from U.S. President Jimmy Carter.
Right.
So this whole pattern of appealing to international actors, it's not a new thing in Brazilian political history.
Okay. And then there's that older video that resurfaced featuring Guilherme Boulos in Portugal. What was that about?
Right. In that video, he was strongly criticizing the Brazilian judiciary's actions relating to Lula's imprisonment at the time, and he explicitly called for international solidarity, mentioning specific political groups in Portugal and Spain, like Bloco de Esquerda and Podemos.
And what kind of language did he use?
His statements in that video were pretty telling. He accused the STF Brazil's highest court of turning its back on the defense of democracy. He suggested the judiciary was overstepping, wanting to take the reins of Brazilian society. He even flat out called Lula a political prisoner.
Wow. So it's striking how similar the language and the appeals are coming from different political actors at different times when they perceive injustice from the judiciary.
It really is. So it seems appealing to international bodies when you feel wronged by your own national system isn't, limited to just one side of the political spectrum in Brazil.
Yeah, it suggests maybe a potentially deeper issue, maybe a lack of trust in domestic institutions that cuts across different political divides.
Could be. Now let's think about the potential fallout from this current situation. Ricardo Diaz, go back to him, he offered some pretty stark predictions, didn't he?
He certainly did. He speculated that these investigations, and maybe even the potential for U.S. sanctions that Bolsonaro is calling for, could actually backfire.
How so?
He suggested they could end up exposing what he believes is an emerging authoritarian streak within Brazil, but exposing it to a wider international audience. Kind of the opposite effect intended by the investigation.
Yeah, and he raised a particularly concerning point, this report, that the PGR has actually requested the Supreme Court to shut down social media platforms.
Shut them down, like, completely.
That seems to be the request reported. Now, that would be an extremely significant step. Huge implications for freedom of expression, people's ability to communicate, organize.
Yeah, that sounds drastic. Dias was clearly very worried about this, suggesting it could push Brazil down a path maybe similar to places like Venezuela or China.
Right, with ordinary citizens ultimately paying the price through more restrictions on their freedoms. That was his fear.
And his sarcastic remarks about Minister Moraes, not needing to worry about travel or credit cards if he has a country just for him.
Yeah, that highlights a perception, rightly or wrongly, of unchecked power. But Diaz's underlying concern, he stressed, was for the average Brazilian, the person who'd bear the brunt of any severe restrictions on communication or, potential international isolation if things went that way.
He also made an interesting point, didn't he, that not all parts of the Brazilian press are necessarily aligned with Minister Moraes on this, suggesting there's some internal skepticism, some concern within Brazil itself about these actions.
Yes, he did mention that.
Yeah.
And his overall characterization of investigating someone simply for reporting an alleged dictatorship. He called it supreme stupidity and utter childishness. That really underscores his conviction that this is a politically motivated overreach with potentially damaging consequences for democratic norms.
So as we sort of wrap up this deep dive, it's clear we're looking at a really tangled web here. You've got these serious allegations of political persecution, a very high-profile investigation into a congressman, this whole historical backdrop of appealing to international bodies,
Right.
and potentially really significant consequences for Brazilian democracy itself and for fundamental rights like freedom of speech.
It's a situation just fraught with complexity. And as we've seen from all the different perspectives we've touched on, there are really no simple answers, no universally agreed upon takes on these events.
And that brings us to our final point, something for you, the listener, to consider.
Right.
What are the broader implications when individuals or political groups feel they need to seek help from international bodies?
Yeah. And conversely, what does it signify when a government investigates those who do make such appeals?
Maybe think about the historical precedents we discussed and the potential long-term impact this could all have on individual liberties and just the level of trust people have in their own institutions within Brazil.
It really forces us to grapple with that delicate balance, between national sovereignty and international norms, and to question where the boundaries of legitimate political discourse actually lie in a functioning democracy.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll be back with more soon.